Hello, everybody. I'm very delighted to welcome you to the fourth lecture in the first round in November Talks for the November Festival in Vienna. I'm really delighted to introduce tonight Bureau Moscow, led by Julia Bodova and Olga Aleksakova. Olga, I know from the time we were both working or studying in Delft, and then she was working also for years in Rotterdam. They started 2004 their office in Moscow, work through the disciplines and to scales, which we will get around now afterwards. And I just learned that they call themselves cleaners and improvers. And I think it's really right if you look to the projects that they give to a certain extent a softness and a kind of enriching element on the harshness, like they expressed now also of a Russian urban context. I was also very pleased to get the tip by a good friend and colleague to ask them to join and also getting in touch again with Olga because they really address that topic we launched for the whole series, how architecture can choreograph urban space, excellently through all scales. So I'm really curious and also maybe not to forget about different scales, different projects, but also teaching on several schools, March in Moscow, but also Columbia University and also the University of Hong Kong. So glad to hear that this knowledge and experience spreads out into the world. So looking forward to hear you and very pleased to have you here, Olga and Julia. The stage is yours, and I will hide till the end of the speech. Yeah?
Thank you for the introduction. Indeed, we work on the intersection of architecture and urbanism and urban planning, and we do it to the extreme. So let us start.
Hello again, everyone, and let us start our lecture, as Olga just mentioned. And again, I am Julia Bodova.
I'm Olga Aleksakova.
And as you know, we are partners at the Bureau Moscow office that is based in Moscow, as you can guess. And this happens for over 15 years. By now, and today we have an office of 20 young and talented people, and mostly we work on different scales, and there are large urban projects, mass housing, and public spaces. And to begin, we have to tell a small story. Like in 2003, OMA made the proposal for renovation of Quarter 75 in Moscow. And by that time, Olga had been working for OMA for 7 years. And the proposal offers 30-story towers implementation in the city tissue instead of typical mass 5-story blocks. And at that time, the former city architect said that that couldn't never happen, and only over his dead body. And the curious thing is today Moscow started a renovation program that is about demolishing all 5-story housing from the 60s. And high rises are rapidly growing up. As in any big city, and Moscow today got a new youngest city architect. So everything is totally changed.
So we divided our lecture in 10 chapters because we know that the Zoom is exhausting, and with the numbers, you know how soon we will be done. And the first is called City in Transition, and that is something that we we witnessed for the past 15 years, but actually it was happening for the past 30 years. Moscow has been undergoing like really massive changes, moving from the socialist city to the city with most like exuberant in itself, very technological, and very comfortable in terms of service. It became a completely different thing. As far as the structure goes, this is the map we did in 2003, and it shows the basically historical center, and then this band of microrayons, districts, living districts, built in, I think the red is the 60s mostly, the green is the 70s, 80s, 90s, and this is this whole post-Khrushchev prefabricated city tissue that composes 70% of the whole building stock. I think by now must be even more. We should do a new map with the 90s and 2000s. That's where we have started. So in this gray sea of seemingly similar but actually very different panel series, we turned it into something not only slightly happier looking, but also conceptually completely different from the modernist spread sort of public nobody's space to the world of urban blocks that is in between. It looks like a European block, but actually it's Asian, and it's an Asian compound. And this kind of city mixture that is now massively happening in the city, and we've been part of reinventing that system. It of course had to go through the massive change of the urban planning tools, where the kind of regulatory and strict Soviet norms that were like many of them were changed into the guidelines for urban development. And the peculiar thing that it was done by a group of 150 very young, very ambitious people, and it's this Strelka Institute that was initially founded as a school, and Rem Koolhaas was the dean of the school. It was a small school, privately funded, and then grew out into this consultancy, and it had a consultancy KB and a consultancy Strelka KB and Strelka Architects, so architects and consultancy offices that did three major developments. So they took a look at all the norms and kind of did this research organizational work and moved the norms into like a different direction. Second, they started the program which was called My Street, changing the streets, the public spaces, the squares, the appearance of first Moscow streets. And third, they took this program to all of the Russian cities, expanded it, and made the cities compete between themselves. So three major tasks that was done by very enthusiastic, very young, and like very energetic team of guys and girls.
Chapter 2 is City Forum. And if you look at the Moscow map, you can see that historically it's a radial city that is consists of many districts, and that is consists of quarters. And this is there are two maps. Actually, one is about the Moscow quarter that is before the demolition, and the right one is about the same quarter after the demolition. And this is concerning mostly the Khrushchev housing that was built in the 60s. And this is this famous Petitashkas, 5-story mass, very cheap houses. And this demolition program was announced by Moscow government in 2003 that actually bring us and as a professionals and city to the new big changes. And there is still an endless discussion on how those areas have to be developed. Is it a massacre of mass housing or a chance for new city development? And from one point of view, this is a very atmospheric, almost bucolic lifestyle there. From the other, the city housing has extremely low density and low quality. Typical quarter from 60s has a standard layout of 5-story typical buildings spread over nobody's land. This is the original map from the 60s. Then you can see the layout. That atmosphere gives one's extreme feelings of freedom in that free space.
And that's the situation in the 2000s. What you see, this microrayon has the size of usually like 400 by 800 meters. It's double or triple of a European bloc. It has a hard edge of taller buildings from the 70s on the perimeter, and inside, so it has like 30% approximately of the to be demolished prefab housing from the 60s with some insertions from 70s. So it's this kind of mixed area with public facilities in the middle, because it was, of course, built with the idea that you can walk to your school or kindergarten within 500 meters distance. So you live there, you study there, you bring your kids to the kindergarten there. And when you look at the property lines, of course, like what Julie said, that the land belonged to everyone, belonged to the city, and the only demarcated plots were the ones in orange for kindergartens and schools, and they belonged to the Ministry of Education. And later, the newly built houses, they also got their own plots, which means that the city land is then divided into almost uncontrollably into this almost medieval map of ownership, with no chance to bring the blocks down onto, to lay the roads, to increase the road networks. So it's when on one hand it has this intrinsic green, beautiful thing around it, but it slowly ceased to exist because the city moves from socialist to capitalist, with land ownership and with the question who is going to pay for all this massive nobody's plots. And there was a competition in 2018 that we did together with our colleagues from MLA Plus, this proposal. So we suggested that you could kind of form the ensembles, finishing, adding new buildings to the existing old ones, having outside border with private courtyards, and keeping the soft nature of the inside of the quarters, having the view to public parks, but then getting away the fences. Another proposal from colleagues of ours in the office, Meganom, they suggested another kind of urban concept of a street yard. So to treat the spaces in between as something in between the street or the courtyard, to sort of give another take, another meaning to this public space in between. So that is an ongoing sort of search and discussion, because in the meantime, the density of these areas, Moscow is growing. So there's a lot of people coming, and there's endless building energy, and the density increased 3 times. So this bucolic, beautiful green quarters are now built, fully built, in order for city not to sprawl. So that's the choice and the discussion that is going on. You go dense, you go high, or, and that's also a source of big urban conflicts at the moment.
Chapter 3, Kids of Parts, brings us back to the master plan organization. And if you look at this diagram, you can see that the typical neighborhood consists of typical parts, and this might be like straight buildings or corner buildings or typical school or kindergartens or administrative and clinic buildings, and the smallest one, the technical buildings. And all Soviet master planning was based on two elements, two sections that faced sun with the short facade or with the long facade. And all these attempts were done only because of the idea to give the inhabitants the proper amount of sunlight. And every section consists of typical apartments. Here you can see 1 room, 2 rooms, 3 rooms, 4 rooms apartments, but all of them were standardized. And once we taught in Marsh School, and we had a course that we called Lifestyles. And we had a group of 20 students, and in the beginning we talked with them and we asked them to describe and to draw their homes, to understand the understanding of scale and proportions, and to show us how they lived then. And actually it was amazing. We were amazed because out of 12 sketches, we got 3 matches. So it's like, and actually students were from every Russian city, so it's not only about Muscovites. And building design were based on the several types of series that had been developed for decades. And on this timeline, you can trace like one series, P3M, that was designed in the 1970s, and it looked like pure modernist building. Later on, were beautifying more and more and more, and in 30 years we saw a lot of postmodernist details over the, for example, over the entrances and above the last story.
And the factories look nowadays completely different. So actually, when we started, the developer asked us to come to the factory and look what can be done with the old molds and this kind of the old Soviet equipment. And we tried and we tried, and we told them, well, there is nothing you can do with it. And after basically a few big developers, they just bought factories. They bought the equipment and they took the Soviet prefabrication onto a completely different level. And onto that level, that actually makes you a little bit scared, because they're going international now, and it became such an automated, high-speed, rather aggressive system that is nowadays, well, the tendency is for it to be fully robotized. Also to get rid of the cheap and low quality labor, which in the end will leave millions of migrant workers, for example, that are now engaged in the building process without work, and their families without income. So these are disruptive processes, and we took part in them, but we are always questioning actually what kind of monster we are creating. On the other hand, this issue of typical and unique always keeps us busy, because of course it's also something that we deal with every day. So when we teach, in Colombia or in Hong Kong or in Amsterdam, we always now ask students to print their hometown 1 to 2000 and to deconstruct it into pieces and to see how many repetitive parts there will be. And it's always sort of doesn't meet your expectations, because you would expect that there's some areas in Hong Kong where people, that maybe it consists out of whatever 2 or 3 elements, even more repetitive than what again the Soviet prefab thing would be. And yet when we ask them how they felt in this, how they were living in these neighborhoods, like none of our Hong Kong students would say like, well, we were not happy, because there is it's not about repetition in the end, it's about how it is filled with life. And actually the most depressing stories we heard from our Amsterdam students who grew up in the new neighborhoods that looked very different, but there was, it seems that there were no life or public meeting places or kind of excitement in it at all. So what we sort of getting at, that things are not always what they seem to be and what they look like. There is more to it, and there is more diversity and repetition and more chances in having affordable, interesting, and different kind of architecture that we used to with our European perception.
Work as an architect in Russia as a big game. In 2008, we took part in the first Moscow Architectural Biennale. And back then, Moscow government announced its plan to build 70 million of square meters of houses, mass housing, by 2025. And according to that idea, we made an installation that we called Capital of Panels. And we actually cut out of the blue foam these 70 million of 70 million square meters of housing, and we imagine them as a free section block. And at this previous image, you saw like we put on the walls 2,500 buildings in scale 1 to 500. And in the middle of this installation we put the cartoon that was about Mario, who actually landed in Moscow and was walking through the city and making it more picturesque, diverse, and colorful.
And that's the game that we're playing ever since. Because you have big developments projects, and then you get a small office gets 1 million square meters to develop, and you can only do that in that new system that we were mentioning before, in the system of new city blocks. So these are units. They are like Asian closed compounds with the artificial garden courtyard on top of the parking spot. That we've seen the same ones in Korea, and these are WhatsApp communities that are united around this courtyard. So you enter from the outside, you exit with your kids to the inside, and this is your public, semi-public courtyards for the inhabitants, with the expensive playground equipment that other people from the other houses cannot visit. But this structure did bring. It made new communities, because it made communities of people that are actually responsible for the courtyard, which you didn't have in a socialist city where no one was responsible for anything and there was no community around anything. And this is a kind of democracy trial or a tryout in this small communities where people learn to take decisions or learn to take responsibility or learn to actually coexist in this madness of a WhatsApp house chat. And as an office, you can only develop that system. We also have a huge lack of architects in the country. If it is a system, And of course, it's based on, we were developing that one with a developer called PIC for 2 years. And it's about, unlike the Soviet system, which was based on very rigid existing sections, this one is a growing one, and it grows with a step of 30 centimeters from the one module to an apartment, to a section, to a block, and to the neighborhood that can be scaled depending on, because the market is changing also very quickly. So every 30 centimeters for a buyer is another million. So, I mean, if you add another 30 centimeters to your apartment, you can put a crib, which means that it's an apartment for a couple with a child, potentially. Where you have, so you make a very wide offer on the market with a very small differences, but yet to develop these plans, again, it took us 2 years, because every centimeter counts, and you have the range of sizes, which you can put again in the sections in the block, and you can scale down from requests from Moscow to now everything covers the whole of Russia, from Moscow to Vladivostok. And the whole thing is based on the typical, on standard IKEA set furniture. So you get a brief from the client, which gives you the composition of the family, and you attach furniture to it. And because it's also small, so it's affordable housing, it has like every, again, centimeter counts. You just work with a set of furniture to make a minimum apartment for people to afford to live.
And for that plant system, we can develop an enormous amount of the facade solution that actually offers a concept of semi-typical housing, that there are all invisible standardized, all the standardized parts are invisible, and all visible parts are flexible. And here on this map you can see the like red dots. Actually buildings, the iconic buildings that we made for most important developer in Moscow. And of course, with such kind of system, you can do it like this, or like that, or like this, or again like that. But all these picturesque facades patterns are usually a result of a long design process. The aim is to connect these new buildings with the existing context. And for example, in our office, we have a tennis table, and these models, it's one option, like a lot of options for one buildings. And it took us a year to choose the right color and the right composition and the right color combination.
But then I think we have to say that this it was intended to be contextual, but the production is so massive that it got completely out of control. So you see this colorful houses being produced without, I mean, you open the website of the developer, and then it's just an overkill of colorful blocks. So in a way, what we said before, that we created a monster that yeah, sort of when uncontrolled in it's a little scary. Well, still it's happier than what it used to be, but architects should always be involved. No system can replace us. Chapter 5 is called Schools, Kindergartens, and Excel, and it has to do with Julie was saying before that 3 of our students grew up in exactly the same apartment, and there has not been enough, I think, study about the mentality of the whole nation that grew up in exactly the same condition. And also, what also needs to be said, that the way people got the apartments made the mixture, the social mixture within this blocks very, very diverse. So people are used to live next to, like, a professor is living next to a plumber, and that's why this prefab areas are not turning into a ghetto. because it's always quite a healthy mix of people. And then the same goes for schools and kindergartens. And then was a studio we did with students from Lausanne and Studio We, where we took a look at another Soviet heritage, and this are schools and their plots, because these are the territories of freedom, and because they were always fenced off, it's the city resource, the ones that we were showing also, like the soft middle. So we counted 1,727 schools in Moscow, but when you look closer, it comes down to 4 typologies. So again, our Russian students went to exactly 4 typologies, and also us. Like, this one is from the 50s. This one, the O shape, is from the 80s. So I went to this one, Julie went to this one. My kids are going to also this one, and your kids to this one. It comes down to 4 basic types that also define your school life, because it's exactly the same stories where you had fun, where you had whatever public performances, so the experiences are very, very shared. And together with the different typologies, there are also different number of square meters that is attached to the plot. So the latest plots are enormous. This is parks with a fence, where you have to enter with a key card. And when our kids go into school, we get an SMS that your child entered the object, your child exited the object. So like a little bit military, there's little prisons in the middle of quarters. So when once you get to develop, to build a new one, which is not or a new typical, actually it becomes a new typical, we got an assignment we got a project to build a new one, and your only client is Excel sheet, because it's a state school. So you don't talk to anyone. You have the Excel sheet with exact number of prescribed square meters per person for each function. And then later, when you get a plot, which is mostly a leftover plot in this urban plan that no one could use, then and you're so stupid to choose the round shape, you won't be talking to the school director. You will be trying to fit the Excel into the round shape to make it look decent. And for half a year, you're pushing that, because your allowance is a state money, so you have to be exactly to the sheet. And we'll try to solve this puzzle. Instead of talking to the director, to the parents, to like other people, you are solving this mathematical task issue. Yeah, but a well-trained architect can manage, so we did.
And finally, we got it built. And actually, it was an interesting story, because then the client had chosen the general contractor. He gave him only the plans for this building, and he discovered that the facades have such interesting windows only then the contract was signed.
He was upset.
He was a little bit upset, but he managed in the end.
He was also a well-trained contractor.
Yeah. And during the design process, we were trying to imagine kids' life in that Excel-made space. And we imagine the life, actually, and we represent it as a diary of one day life in the kindergarten. So, for example, this is a living room, and this is the music hall, and this is the recreation room. And so this the lifestyle of today's kids in this building, and actually we got it exactly like it was imagined and it was drawn. So
yeah, maybe one thing to add, that we had the ground floor is where the smallest kids are. It's completely transparent, and the only thing that the teachers are complaining about is the parents stick to the windows and they don't leave. So the kids are sitting on the floor, and the parents are all kind of in front of the glass window and watching the children, but the teachers, they kick them out. So the chapter 6 is called Street and Squares, My Street and Squares, and it refers to the program which we talked about, My Street, started by Strelka, of total makeover of the ground level. They're putting new sewer, new electrical, like the whole networks were redone, the streets were redone, because the Soviet street was mostly used for demonstration and queuing. There was absolutely no public life. Everything that happened in the apartments. In '89, a French student came to visit me, and we were living in a high-rise apartment on the ground floor. So she crawled out of the window and sat on the grass. And I looked out of the window, and there was a crowd of people gathering and looking at her, because it was absolutely unimaginable that you would sit on the grass outside. So people were like really, really different in the city. But then the first president, very important president that happened, was the Gorky Park project. And it was done by the new director, Sergei Kapkov. It opened park to the public by doing two very simple things: putting the invisible guards, not the kind of the armed one in the camouflage, but guys in the dark, beautiful outfits and on the bicycles, and making clean toilets. So these two things, just cleaning up and making proper toilets, and it changed the place completely. The thing is that it became a huge success. People from all over the city were coming just to enjoy the space and to feel themselves in the city and to be together in the space, which was something absolutely different and absolutely new. At some point, the Gorky Park looked like an urban planner wet dream, because you couldn't, there was dancing on the right, volleyball on the left, like all the sorts of urban activity you could imagine, especially summer in Russia is short, but actually in winter it's like a skating rink. It was so intense and so like concentrated that actually its success killed it a little bit, because it was just like too much. But it gave people the idea that the city belongs to them, and they claimed the street. So in 2014, when there were the protests against the Putin-Medvedev power exchange, then they formed a lifeline around the main street, it's Moscow Garden Ring, and they claimed the street, and with the help of media, they placed themselves on the map to kind of claim the ring, to make the space. And then somehow the city thought, what an interesting idea, what a useful tool to give people sort of the easiest thing, to give them public space, which is beautiful, give you a stage to act, makes you sort of friendlier and happier in the city. So, okay, if you want to have streets, there you go. Here are your streets.
And chapter 7, after that, is Operation Garden Ring. And this is one of the Moscow longest and biggest and most beautiful street that is 16 kilometers long. And besides that, the city government understood that like city landscaping can become a political tool. Also, at that period, Moscow was in waiting of football championship 2018, and this event actually made a great impact for Moscow's public spaces. For 2 years, 16 kilometers of garden ring were completely redesigned, and actually at this map you can see in this, for example, round-shaped numbers, you can see how many offices were involved in this project. And it was, as I said, it was lasting for 2 years, and the scale of operation were enormously big. Even all local granite fields were empty. And as this concept was developed by Strelka Institute as well, and it called 100 Gardens. And because of this concept, they bring back big plants to the garden ring, actually to the Moscow streets. And you can see very well how this streets became a public spaces. People really started walking All cafes and shops are open 24 hours, 7 days a week. So it's really a new Moscow round public space.
And on the wave of this endless landscaping, we took part in, it was the first competition, because before it was always a tender, so there was no architectural competition for public spaces, and we took part in this Triumphальная Square competition, and we were lucky to win it. Triumphальная Square is on the crossing of the Garden Ring and the main Tverskaya Street, and it's been always a bit odd. It's in front of the major concert hall. Has Mayakovsky monument in the middle, and in the 60s it's been a place of where the poets used to come, where the youth used to, so it has this romantic flair of the 60s, somehow very strong. And at the time it was very, the air of freedom and of the 2000s and of the 60s was kind of aligned at the time. So but the square itself, it's above the most beautiful metro station, and it became a place for people to meet on the 31st of every second month to support the 31st article of the Constitution, which protects the freedom of speech. So there was an unpleasant event for the city that was every time ended up with police coming and picking up the protesters, and then the city would always look for some way to close the square, to make it unavailable for crowds, either for architectural dig or putting, like in this one, they were putting awkward tents with restaurants on top, or parking, or something that would prevent people from gathering. And suddenly there was an announcement that some company won tender for the square, and then people who already claimed their streets before, they came out on the street and said, no, that's not how it's going to be. We want architectural competition. So,
and by that time, Moscow, as I mentioned before, got a new city architect, and he was very much for architectural competition, which actually that was not an obvious thing for Russian architectural practice. And it was actually first public competition that was announced in 2014. And it was like a big professional event. And we luckily won this competition with the empty square. So we just put as a main element, we put the swings and make a square flat, and put the pop-up seats for the city concert and some city events. And we framed this space with the trees lines, trees walls, to form it and bring it to the human scale. And why swings? Actually, every Soviet courtyard had the only entertainment thing is in the middle. It was always swings, and the kids played there, adults danced there. So even in the famous movie from the 60s, we can see how it happened back then. And the square were empty, and people were not happy how actually it was before and how it is now. And this big change with one of the main city public space could invite actually people, involve them to the city processes. And for example, this is the announcement of Active Citizen. It's a government platform that was about asking people people's opinion. And for example, we made two images, square with trees and square without trees, and it was people were asked what they like mostly. And actually it was funny because we got a lot of phone calls from friends of us and friends of us and from family, and we were all asking us what they had to vote for. And okay, come on, guys, it's just an open platform. Just look, choose what you like. But it was so unusual for our lifestyle that we were really asked, and somebody were interested in the people's opinion. So at the end, 95% vote for the square, like everybody likes it. And it's
when we started working on it, we had to change some things because emptiness didn't fly, because no city wants to have an empty square that can potentially contain crowds. We had to add pavilions, we had to add flower beds. It became, well, in the end, it became prettier and sort of more cozy, and the swings moved to the subway entrance, so no one now can miss it, and people pass by, they all stop. And this swings are the double wide, so it's especially for dating, it's very popular for dating. The only thing, you have to come in advance, because if sometimes you need to queue, and you have to queue. It's really catchy, the thing. And funny is that the producer, the concrete factory that did it, they started selling it by themselves. So now it was done especially for that square, but now you can buy them and find them in all unexpected places in the city. And when we complained to the city architect that actually that's not what we had in mind, he replied like, it's okay, it's a sign of success. So we took it for that. And actually it is, works for all the ages. And again, we had to cut our granite small, because all of it was used for the garden ring. Not only we were out of granite, but there was also a story with tricky trees. When we did landscaping around the famous worker and peasant monument. And but that's a place, like, if most of the places are where people come and form crowds, this is one is in the outskirts, but still it had to look decent, but it's completely empty. No one gets there except for it makes nice pictures because there is no one ever in the pictures. Where we mirrored and brought back the original old design and make it rather classical. And then there's it's so empty that one day the trees were gone. They planted the trees and then they were gone, and now people didn't notice until the next day. And what we found out, that they took in the night, they took the trees to put them for the opening of the Gorky Park entrance, and then a week later they brought them back. So it was a happy ending to the story.
And chapter 10 is
last one.
Is the expansion, and this is about the idea that actually positiveness of new Moscow public spaces influences the whole country. For example, once we came to Saratov. This is a city in the middle of Volga River, and in the front of the central railway station we saw actually the model mock-up one-to-one of this railway station city square, and it was done by Westacht, and the mock-up were intended to ask people's opinion about the city design, but as we realized later, people were really against this action, actually not because of the design, and just because they really didn't understand the idea why the city government had to invest money into the city landscaping, because they really didn't understand and didn't feel this positive result that we, for example, we got in Moscow after, of course, a series of negative emotional reactions. And Strelka's work made the city to compete with each other. Today's cities fight for the best public space, and Of course,
it's the quality index.
Yeah,
the points of the most.
For example, Moscow had
the highest.
The highest, yeah, and then St. Petersburg and Nizhny Novgorod, and so then goes down. And of course, city mayors are very involved in this game because they understand that is a real political
tool. And then some of them were completely surprised when the results came in, and then there was like Volgograd or something, that people were completely shocked that they got such low points. And that's yeah, it's a good tool to make politicians aware of how bad they are, or how bad they treat their citizens. So yeah, we got a project in Blagoveshchensk, another square, and it's 7 hours flight from Moscow on the border with China. So on the other side of the river, there is Heihe, and this is an old Russian city of Blagoveshchensk with a kind of grid structure, very 18th century beautiful town. And then they compete. Now they're not only competing with, among each other, they also compete with China. So China has this beautiful skyline with lights in the night, and the whole, and the Wallace ring, and then it all like the promises of bright future on the other side. So of course the Russian side also has to do something. They added an embankment, a completely new embankment, which is 8 kilometers long. This whole white part is the completely new embankment, and there was definitely nothing wrong with the old one. But it's the big projects they expanded, and then the park. So the park is the size of Moscow multi-million Zaryadye Park by Dylan's video. That is the most expensive and difficult to maintain landscape dreams for Moscow, the capital. And then you come there and you just see this enormous size of the project. When you draw it, you already see that it's enormous. But then, so this is the skyline, of course, with a big church on one side, and then we try to do some kind of hilly stuff that you see something from the Heihe side, and it's just insane. So that's the thing when you have too much free space and too much state money. But still, to finish this trip, we have an incredibly powerful tool in our hands. So we as architects, we not only create public spaces, but we form people's minds, we form people's behavior. What we also saw in our housing complexes, for example, that by making it nice, you change people's attitude. For example, in old houses, they would always destroy the common staircase, public entrances, and the new ones, if you make it with love and care, then people change their attitude. And the same, people change the way they behave in public. When we made wider streets, for example, then more comfortable streets, people walk slower. When they make a square where people can sit down and they look into each other's eyes, and then you get, then you get somehow democracy. We believe that will help democracy and sort of tolerance, most importantly, work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a nice journey through a lot of different projects, different skills, and especially changing the situation, or let's say the how people use space, or how do they look at it, kind of changing perspectives completely, which I find super interesting. Maybe just a quick question to the YouTube chat. Are there questions, let's say, directly to the talk there? No questions yet. So we will start, let's say, among us, Mike. And it was really super nice to hear, but also kind of to see, let's say, the approaches to the different scales, and kind of what I found pretty interesting is, on one hand, also that kind of analysis you also did with students yourself, kind of in a way to the bits and pieces, that is kits of parts, and also to the CD form, and And then kind of directly this question came to mind, because you look then to different grain, and which addresses directly again the human scale. And in a lot of projects that is really clearly visible, and also looking into creating communities. And I was wondering kind of in that part where I said kind of creating by this WhatsApp house chat, so to say, but also creating an interior space, let's say, for the community in each plot, kind of trying to change, because I also saw that when I was in Russia, kind of in a way that there's no care, let's say, trying to evoke care, to take care about public space, because that was not at all, let's say in Soviet times, not at all the case. For me, it was when I was in Russia the first time, it was embarrassing to see, let's say, how even a staircase in a building looks like, and then you open a door and in your beautiful flat, but the staircase was, yeah, nothing. You wouldn't have ever expected that kind of luxury flat there, but this is also kind of a result of the political situation and kind of how people were brought up. But you create now by all works kind of a transition also in this kind of awareness of taking care and creating community, which I find really amazing.
With the help of there's of course a huge desire to do that with from the developer side, because they see the value to it. And they see, I mean, people do pay for their courtyards and for the maintenance of the, so that police cameras and what you have to pay for maintenance, that changes this.
Yeah, sure.
Slowly,
but surely, yeah.
But is it also not kind of a way, because you showed that comparison of that plots, you know, before and after the demolition, but you also told that there's a kind of density increase of 3, because very often it's also, it was probably also very often about the out of human scale size of this in-between spaces, that also kind of there was no possibility to adapt, you know, in a way, kind of it was just something, a leftover space in between. So the density or the programmatic density plays also, or the embracing of the space by different buildings kind of also plays a role in that.
I think human scale is a difficult issue for the metropolis. I think it's almost impossible to, it's human scale and sprawl, or it's density. So, and we are, I think, convinced of
before both.
Okay, we'll talk later.
But because city can be,
yeah, it can be
diverse.
Yeah, it can be human scale on the level of the ground floor. Of course, we know all these tricks, definitely.
But I think that is visible in a lot of the works, you know, with the kindergarten, this relation between inside and outside. And it's my question, how much, on one hand, kind of the working through the disciplines, urbanism, architecture, but also public space, but also the working, because you, Julia, you are trained mainly in Russia, but let's say, I think, Olga, your kind of experience in a European context kind of also informs how you address things in a different way, or not? What kind of impact, let's say, influence does this have, especially, I think, working through the scales?
Well, I think we are trying to give shape to anything, and that's the basic of architectural education. No? So it's about finding proportions, and the human scale is also about proportions and proper sort of sense of space. It's about giving shape to anything. So, and giving shape creates like hierarchies, creates order, creates calm. And that's we're getting back to the cleaners, and so that is something that we are trying to achieve on every scale.
Very interesting. I thought the lecture fantastic, because it really gave one who is not used to the realities of Russia or Moscow the idea of what it means to make changes on such huge scales. That it's on the one hand it's very scary and it's very exciting at the same time. I had the idea. I found one thing interesting in the first chapter when you were describing these blocks, and you said they're not European blocks, but Asian blocks. And I thought, well, what actually is the difference? And maybe you can talk more about how important these cultural differences are. Because on the other hand, as you said, where you analyzed all these serialization of the 60s and 70s, and you said that you all grew up in 4 different types of schools. So the entire country has basically the same experience of one culture, but then again, there are different cultures. So how does it play in the present when you play out these differences?
Okay, there were 3 questions.
Roughly, yeah.
So I had to write it down.
Well, maybe just start. What can you maybe just with the difference between Asian and European blocks?
Yes. So the European bloc is rarely enclosed with the. Well, there are some blocks from Architect C, kind of in the West 8 plans, but it's. Shall we share the screen again? We can talk on showing hands. So the Dutch bloc has gardens, private gardens. As in Berlin bloc is a courtyard where you pass through. And this one is organized as much more as the Asian thing. It's a gated community with iScan, so people don't have keys, but they have iScans, and kids are very happy because they never lose their keys, because they can always scan their face and enter the house. You know, it's like, it's super comfortable, yet it's a little bit dubious. So it works differently, and it works as a gated community. Mm-hmm. That is about the Asian type of block, because we've seen it in Korea, we've seen it in China is slightly different, because usually they have the plinth on which the towers are and not in a closed block. So slightly different type. Then about cultural differences and people growing in the we went to Dagestan this summer, and there we really saw what the Soviet culture meant and the heritage of Soviet culture, because we were traveling with the guys from Chechen Republic, and we were visiting different nationalities living in Dagestan, and they were all sort of our age, and we grew up watching the same movies. And we had more in common than we would have. I mean, we were completely different cultures. And really, and yet we had a very solid common base. And that was kind of laid, and I think the traces of this common education are still very, very strong, because our kids have also watched the same movies and have also sort of grew up with the same pan-Soviet culture, which you would have like the United States of Europe, but Europe doesn't have that solid base. And also what you also have is that there's a huge, much higher percentage has higher education. That's also a Soviet tradition. So that makes the general public kind of more equal, more connected to that kind of Uber culture. And also more used to the neighbors, let's say. So you don't have good and bad neighborhoods. You have that mix that I mean, you always grew up with the drinking plumber. You know how to deal with it. These are not aliens. These are people that you share, where you try to share less, but when you know how to deal with it. And that, of course, changes, because people who can buy apartments slightly, it's upper middle class, but still it's and then you have, of course, migrants. That's a big group of people that is definitely less integrated, but they all watch the same movies. So it's an interesting, still interesting melting pot that influences, of course, the urban condition and the way people coexist in the metropolis.
Soviet heritage is still very,
very strong.
Yeah. Let's say what is also, and from what I found also interesting, you showed, let's say, this kind of modularity in school types or kind of also building types. So there's a also very equal, let's say, building condition or kind of where children go to school. So that's also very comparable. So how do you think kind of that built form and space also informs this as well? I think it's not only about movies, it's also about kind of having, let's say, it's politics, it's a very unique, let's say, approach to several generations, kind of that is very, also very top down, very much controlled. But let's say with all of what I saw now, kind of the work kind of that will also change that kind of obedience kind of to some authentic kind of equality, because they're different, you create different spaces that inform, let's say, also children going to that school in a completely different way.
Yeah, and it's also, people look at people who used to get the apartments from state, look at these things differently. Because that's why this idea of an apartment as a car, people buy apartments like they buy cars. They only look what you said, like you can enter the most horrible housing entrance, and then your space starts from used to, that is changing. Used to start from the double metal entrance door, but that is slowly changing. Still, people, we once met on a train. We met a woman who bought an apartment in our house, so in the one that we decided, and we were like, "Oh, so cool! So you liked it?" And she didn't see any difference between our pretty blocks and the other one, because she just looks at the apartment, the price. So the apartment plan, yeah. Without, she didn't even know in which building she bought because you can do it all online, by the way. So people buy plans online, and without choosing the neighbors, without choosing the neighborhoods, they buy square meters. But it's not for. I mean, they still live in the square meters. So okay. It's a consumption of urban space that still is different.
Is it possible to sort of transfer this fixation on the interior and of being like cocooned inside your apartment into the exterior, and sort of draw people outside by making exterior spaces somehow appealing in the same way?
I think it already happened, kind of. I think, let's say, what you did with the Triumphania Square, in a way, kind of bringing in something that was in each courtyard, which also is something that belongs to the culture for a long time, but in a completely different condition, kind of, I think, brings people kind of in a way, in a very playful but also very sensible way, to kind of sensitive way to use a public space, which they probably 20, 30 years earlier never would have imagined to do.
And you see it with the glass bus stops and with the new electro buses. Like, no one is damaging the seats, no one is breaking the glass, because like years ago you would say, a glass bus stop, forget it, that would never happen. But they are there, and they're used and taken care of. So, of course, has to do with the army of migrants cleaning the streets. It's the rule of the first scratch, the first, if you leave a Mercedes and the first scratch on everybody. So the attitude is changed by sort of the atmosphere of order and comfort and control to a degree.
Yeah. No, but what I really find, because you said it's not about human scale, but still, I think in all works you have shown now, I clearly see a lot of elements that address that scale or breaking, it's trying to diminish in a way this kind of huge scale, you know, of the metropolis, kind of this huge facades also in this building, and breaking it into elements that are to a certain extent playful and people can adapt to, because it's not this sheer vast kind of, you know, facade that kind of has no relation anymore to other scales. So sure, it's not maybe exactly, let's say it's not addressing directly the human scale, but you break this huge masses into different bits and pieces, kind of in this kits of parts, which I think is, and also kind of elements that are new, like this circular, you know, kind of trying to, and I find this incredibly good to see kind of, you know, it's an Excel sheet, but kind of how do we mathematically, how do we bring this Excel sheet into a kind of a form that touches the emotions of people.
And it's been, this round shape is a new typical one. It's added to the previous 4. So we see it coming, we see it repeating everywhere.
Yeah, okay, yeah, okay.
But without the windows.
Yeah. But also
there was a question from the, there was a question from the YouTube audience, and we touched upon it a bit. Is there a strong demand for modern public spaces in Moscow?
I think Moscow is.
Yes, it depends on what modern is.
Yeah, Moscow is saturated with public space at the moment. It's been because my street turned into my park and my courtyard, and people are a little tired of. People are a little tired of architects. Urbanist is a swear word.
Really?
No.
Because there was such a huge surge within a short time, so people have had enough now.
So, anyway, all these public spaces are full.
Yeah,
they will be full, even if
they hate us.
Much more public spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think. But for me, this question, did it, let's say this, how did it work out in that project you've shown with this WhatsApp house chat? How do people use, let's say, the courtyard now?
It's a closed area. It's like full, people pay for that.
The maintenance.
For the maintenance, so it's quite expensive, I have to say. And of course,
it's working.
Yeah, it's working because parents let their kids freely go there and walk, and they just watch out of the windows, and just we have to ask our neighbors not to. And so it really nicely working, and it works like a gated community, so almost full, and looks very nice.
I was wondering when you showed this nationwide analysis or competition, which the Strelka Institute did, where the cities compete with the quality of the public spaces. I mean, not to get too technical about it, but how does this quality index work? Because it sounds like something which every country should have. What are the main criteria?
Made a manual like that. It's a quantifying index where you have to.
Like a catalog.
Yeah, I forgot to mention in introduction because but also I know Strelka, and maybe it's also good to explain to let's say the listeners, kind of to the crowd, kind of what it really is, because I think the impact of all the work, because you work as a supervisor there, and how far you have been involved in the beginning. Because I think Strelka had a huge impact kind of on the transformation of
only being the very first studio, teaching a studio on, not teaching, but leading a studio on energy, because they were in the beginning they were just big subjects about gentrification or no, about countryside that developed into exhibition later, energy, thinning, all the subjects. So there were 5 big subjects that were major research issues, and then it developed slowly. It's been already 7 years ago, or more, 10 years ago, that they started, and then it developed into a local interior research institute.
And they do a lot of researches, and actually a lot of Moscow Russian architects involved as a consultant to their research. So we are often helps them.
There's a huge impact in the rethinking of the city. I can imagine.
It's also
impressive.
Impact how they educated the authorities. So we were making Triumphальный, we were going to the first meetings, and then you have to explain, like no one knew how to do things. And you had to explain and talk and figure out things. And then 2 years later, when we were also taking part in drawing the garden ring, then all the city authorities knew the words that we didn't know. So they totally mastered the vocabulary, and everyone knew about the section of the granite and this kind of the French drainage. So no, it's huge work, and it's of course about education. Everything is about talking, educating, and telling, and making precedents. But it's worth it.
But also making
it a great experience, because everyone's sort of starting from scratch at the same time, and you don't have like lots of generations. They know we've never done it that way. We've always done it this way. Start go away, because everyone is sort of at the starting line from the beginning, and then it sort of goes.
And but the cool thing is that the energy of these young guys was so strong that everyone backed off. So that when they were really able to, like the young transport planners, they were really able to push their ideas through. That was amazing to see.
I think the change in a way, but I think it would be interesting, kind of like to discuss certain things. For instance, I didn't know, let's say, the story so strongly about the garden ring, but or also this kind of manifestation that people who said the street is ours, kind of, that is something that needs to happen in certain kind of European cities, also in Vienna, and saying what the street is a public space. So it is for people as well, and not only for certain kind of selection of vehicles. And let's say to really go for that in a way, to and make a change. It's amazing kind of to see that change happens then finally, kind of to really transform something into a completely, really a space where a lot of people can take advantage from.
Yeah, and
it was also because there was such a lack of, let's say, awareness of that the street is not only for demonstrations or manifestations or public, let's say, so to say, top-down public events and queuing, but can also be used for completely different kind of needs.
Yeah, but the advantage of dictatorship is that you can do these things really quickly.
Yeah, sure. That is. But how does this, because you were also mentioning, and I think you really do, to democratize, kind of spaces, kind of, because with a lot of your projects, you try to really do that, kind of looking into how, democracy, people kind of really engage with, which was not possible kind of in the Soviet time. Kind of, it was not about it. It was just kind of, following kind of the rules, and if not, kind of, there was a problem. But by doing that, I think you really, let's say, this have a huge impact on the change of thinking and living habits, and this kind of political aspect. Let's say, urban design as a political tool, but also architecture as a political tool, or let's say, the play between the three disciplines as a political tool. I think it's because it's the, let's say, to engage with, it's always the space in between, how I call it, which it's urban space or public space, or let's say even maybe semi-public space, but there people get together.
Yeah, you give shape to urban space, and by that you define, you try to define people's behavior and the level of their responsibility for that space.
Yeah. Because this is a huge, let's say, change, let's say, in Russia, kind of, let's say, in that sense, kind of, and that was, and it's quite a time ago, but what I also felt there, that was also during the summer school, kind of how to, and we were kind of really, impressed by also students, kind of, that they the first round, they started very playful, you know, kind of creating ideas. And then after the first exercise, you had kind of they got stuck and they couldn't develop it further. And then we were asking what's going on. Yeah, normally our teachers tell us how to do. And so said, no, we are not telling you how to do. Kind of, we like to engage you to develop your own ideas further. And let's say we really got first kind of in touch kind of when we had in the evening, let's say, sit together at the beach somewhere at the Volga and having a beer. And then they start to get loose to talk about what the education had looked like before, you know. And for us, it was okay, then we could slowly understand that we have to deal with that differently because they're so completely unused to what we thought how we would like to set it up. But I think it's changing a lot, and seeing all these projects, I think there's a strong transition in let's say this, engaging as kind of critical with a critical eye and as a critical citizen, kind of looking at things. And
we see it also with the young guys who work with us, that it reminds me to Holland in the 2000 end of 90s. There's the same engagement, energy, and like people don't leave at 6. People are like super excited, but also super capable because they're hungry for knowledge, and this kind of the system that you're talking about when the professor says and then we do what he says, that's it's gone. So we enjoy the luxury of people who don't leave at 6 because they have work-life balance. It's very nice.
Well, but I can also, how do you feel like, kind of, Julia, did you also, let's say, because you also brought up in Russia, Olga, but kind of then you spent a long time in Europe. And this, let's say, what I, from my experience, let's say the advantage, or let's say the luxury, I need to say, kind of to work in different cultural contexts kind of informs strongly, let's say, this constantly critical eye on maybe, we can approach it in a different way because in another country it's also possible. That informs very much kind of how I address things. I can imagine that it's for you the same.
But also the teaching, I mean, teaching is definitely, I think that informs you the most, and there's differences between the Hong Kong school, the Columbia, the Amsterdam University, and the input that students bring it's a huge, well, you know, that's what influences you the most. But working here, it's this, that's why we call it free space, because it's so unexpected. No one expects Russia to be free, but it does give you a very weird freedom because there is so much to do, that there is a freedom of choice what you're going to do. And actually, if you want to achieve something, it's possible, and that it gives you wings. It's really makes you forget and forgive all the background that is completely definitely there, but it feels free in a strange way.
Yeah, but I can imagine
professional and also, I guess, culturally. In some ways.
Visible in a way, kind of, you know, let's say, but even in a bit of that way, I would say you analyze very radically, let's say, the possibilities within an Excel sheet, or let's say the industrial elements, you know, kind of the, let's say, when you were talking about that, let's say the modularity and a different kind of building elements, kind of in a way, kind of how to, but how can you, with a lot of creativity, and kind of tip the point, kind of, and turn it into an advantage, to change, let's say, to get away from the disadvantages of this, change it into something positive, and take the maximum, let's say, create the maximum impact. I think that is, let's say, for me, clearly visible in, let's say, what I learned now today, what you presented, kind of to really analyze it strongly, being very radical with what is asked, and then kind of just playing with it in a very creative way.
That's the OMA heritage.
Yes. So, But
yeah,
well,
I also thought it was very Dutch, or this, but maybe because I don't know the Russian tradition so much, maybe I'm wrong, but this was a very clean analysis of let's just not say this is good or this is bad, let's just look at everything that is there and analyze it in a very clean and graphic way, and then we decide we took this one, we take this one, we took this one.
The opportunistic Dutch approach.
Yes.
No, there is more in it. I think what I also think is this social and human aspect you both bring in it, which is different. Kind of, there is also this kind of in a way also let's say, even how you present, to this togetherness. You were talking about together, so let's say this notion of togetherness kind of appeared several times, or community. And I think that is something that is clearly, in my opinion, visible in how you approach things, but also probably how you work together with your team. And but it's also visible in all the projects. That there's also always the social aspect in it, which is, I think, something in addition to a very pragmatic.
Yeah,
So there's another layer on, let's say, that what you would say kind of the OME or the Dutch heritage. There is a level on top of it, which I think makes it really different.
It's really the European Asian mixture. So the togetherness is really Asian. We find whether being to Hong Kong or being to China or speaking with the students, that the ability to live together, not in a, because I mean, here family is a little underrated. People live in a wider circle than a circle of friends, connections. It's this kind of, it's a, like in China, a wider society around you than a family cell. So family cell is fine, but you are equally connected to many other people. So you live together, and that is also what you rightfully noticed as a background to also design and to how you approach the togetherness and coexisting in the same space of city.
Yeah, and I think also, let's say, for also in the kindergarten, we know how, let's say, with the windows, but also this kind of very open, let's say, allowing for this interaction between outside, inside. I can totally imagine that if, let's say, parents kind of stand there and watching, or maybe others watching. But I think that we had in earlier talks as well, and also kind of, let's say, how public space, let's say, or this kind of community and getting together, or even seeing, I think the pandemic showed this, let's say, especially here in Europe, I don't know how it was in Russia, kind of in a way, how much we relate to, or let's say, how much we need to, let's say, different, seeing different people, seeing different kind of, also strange, let's say, people we don't know, kind of to put ourselves really into, let's say, to relate ourselves to, let's say, to others, but also to ourselves again, kind of how to mirror with people. And that was really in one of the first rounds in the pandemic. I had a peer review at the AA, and there were kind of people sitting all over around the world to peer review, let's say, the projects of the students prior to their last presentation. And let's say, I was just telling about kind of what I sensed kind of in this very open, let's say, Dutch, Swiss conditions, kind of being capable constantly can go outside, go to work, maybe if they're not so many people. So there was a lockdown, but never in the sense like in other kind of countries. And that I sensed very strongly that a lot of people kind of address you, just people you normally don't look at, kind of, but you get in a talk or even just a glimpse or a smile on the face. And there was a person sitting, I forgot his name, an architect from Cyprus, and said, because I said that it's really nice to get engaged with this kind of people also on the street. And he said, I would like to see a stranger. I'm really fed up kind of with sitting kind of constantly with the same. And I think this is really something that is also this advantage of, let's say, also the need of public space to confront ourselves with difference, the unknown.
Yeah, totally.
And would be super cool to discuss this kind of further in informal way, kind of somewhere. We just kind of in a free talk yesterday, we said kind of we will do that kind of hopefully soon, wherever in Moscow or in Rotterdam or in Amsterdam or Vienna, because that is really what we miss, you know, kind of this informal. We had it slowly, kind of meanwhile in between, but now we like it again. But I think, yeah, step by step, get there. Do we have other kind of, there are no questions in no comments. Yeah, YouTube is encouraged, feel free. Some questions from the crowd. It was so interesting. People don't. No. Mike.
Maybe one question about something you said in a quick talk before the lecture. Two things. Well, one that Ute mentioned when she introduced you was that you see yourself as cleaners and improvers. And another thing which you said was that you try to achieve some kind of softness and kindness. And I wonder if how that goes together. I mean, if everything is sort of cleaned and improved, how does the softness come in? Doesn't the softness need some kind of fuzziness? How can you have a clean softness?
First you create order, first you clean up, and then you put cushions.
That's a good answer, yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's in a way, yeah, you know, knowing some, let's say, Russian public spaces, kind of how they looked like, you know, this harshness. And I think a lot of the public spaces, this playfulness within the facades, but also the buildings, or let's say also on the squares, kind of that is, and always soft elements in it, you know, is something that and tangible in a way. Kind of you could sit on this kind of piece of grass, you know, on the last square you showed, kind of, because it's not, and otherwise it was much more representative, kind of flowery, you know, kind of you cannot use is in a way kind of to really engage and use this public with the spaces and kind of sit somewhere. Some spaces invite you to use them, like the swing is kind of a very playful example, but also the seats, so you can jump, you can, I think that a lot of public spaces were before very, very representative, very untouchable. And that is kind of that softness, kind of I really, really clearly see in what you're doing in relation to, let's say what it was before. And that also always have to be in that kind of dialogue with what are people used to.
Yeah, now we have to fight the abundance of benches and playground equipment that they're filling with all the parks. And
yeah,
we would prefer the untouchable one, actually.
Yeah, but is it not also kind of what we have very often in this discussion now in public spaces, but also in, let's say, urban furniture, that it's very often our spaces at all, that they are far too much designed and, let's say, to a certain kind of need and not anymore in that way allowing for different uses, which I think that is really crucial, kind of that people can really use them in completely different ways. And let's say, I saw now in the proposal of the Palnia Square, let's say, elements that are clearly open for different use. And not only for one kind of, you could, let's say, you can use the seats for, you can even use it as a skateboarding or whatever, jump up and down, but you can also use them for a manifestation, for a cinema, for event on the square. So, but you can also use them if you just want to sit together with someone eating a sandwich. And I think that is also something I saw now, for instance, a lot of European cities, due to the pandemic, kind of not so long ago when I was in Vienna, there's this long bench in the entrance of the museum square. I think before that kind of piece was not so often used in that way, but this was full, you know, with kind of people, kind of pairs, kind of 4 or 2 people just eating what they found, let's say what they bought somewhere around and enjoying the sun in a public space, because there are not so many spots where you really can enjoy the sun if it's kind of very flat in winter time, you know? And how to provide spaces that are used in completely different ways throughout the season or throughout the day or the week. This is really something we have to think about.
Yeah, with the bench, we had this 16 kilometers long garden ring made by 115 officers, and they were all young officers, and of course everybody makes mistakes. So there was I think a 400-meter long bench, and then our professor Edmar, he was arriving home from the airport. The taxi dropped him off at the pocket very nicely, and then he had to walk with a suitcase over this 400-meter bench to cross to his entrance of the house. So yeah, there are benches and there are benches, but you know, every time better.
He knew whom to call.
Yeah, he knew whom to call.
Yes, sure. So 400 meters is quite a size, yes, for a bench. It's true.
Okay, maybe it wasn't necessary. 100 meters long. But still.
I thank you very, very much. It was really, for me, really an eye-opener on several kind of levels. I was really enjoying very much, and I hope I see you soon in person wherever we're, and let's keep in touch. Thanks for.
Thank you very much for the invite.
Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Good evening, and drink a glass together, kind of.
Definitely.
Now together with you. Yeah. Hi. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.